Hi, welcome and thank you for joining us today at Workday for our second session in the Accessibility Level Up series. My name is Elle Waters and I'm here today with Stacey Romero for a fireside chat to talk about building the business case for accessibility. We hope you'll learn some techniques to increase adoption of your accessibility initiatives within your organization. So let's get started. Stacey, I love hearing about how people get into this line of work. Everyone has a different story to tell. So why don't you tell me your origin story?
Yeah, thanks for asking the question, Elle. So I've been here at Workday. I joined April of last year, so just under a year. And prior to that, I was with a different organization for almost 19 years. Most of my time I spent in the training part of the organization. And I had a role where I was responsible for leadership development. And one day on a company, I was on a business trip and I met some folks from that organization's accessibility team. And I had this aha moment because I realized that there were people leaders who were blind. And as a result, they were being excluded from the same leadership training opportunities that every other employee had. And it wasn't intentional by any means, but the materials we were using were not accessible. And so if you're giving somebody a printed guide, it doesn't work very well, right? And so I went on this journey of like, I have to do better. We need to fix this, right? And so it wasn't about asking that team to own it for me, but I decided to lean in and say, I can't fix this for the whole company, but what can I do in the area like that's within my sphere of control to try to make this situation better? I started trying to learn, how do I make materials accessible? How do I start to put pressure on vendors if we're purchasing materials from them to say, hey, the value you're giving us isn't the same if not all of our employees are able to use this. And ultimately that led me into the accessibility field. And I did accessibility work for about 5 years before coming and joining Workday.
That's fantastic. And so now you lead the disability inclusion team, focusing on workmates, employee accessibility in workplace. I love that we have a sister organization. I work on the product accessibility team, and I think I've always been passionate about emerging technologies, big old nerd growing up, and also human rights too has always been really central to the things that I'm invested in. It's funny that we both came from sort of a corporate environment. I moved into a corporate role and I had friends taking bets on how long I would last. I think the longest was 6 weeks that people thought that I would last in corporate America. And my manager at the time was a little concerned about me being a flight risk. So I was working as a front-end web developer and he asked me to make the Medicare website 508 compliant. So for those of you who are not aware, this is a federal procurement law in the United States, and Medicare is required to be able to provide equal access to everyone in digital properties. So I thought this will take me about 3 months, and and so I kept pulling at these threads, and every time I would see a challenge, not only did I get a firsthand understanding working and talking to people whose lived experiences were totally impacted, but it also seemed to be a much more systemic problem. And much like yourself, it becomes a little bit daunting when you think about all the things that you have to do in order to be able to really achieve accessibility at a corporate or enterprise level at a large scale. And so that was 5 years, a little longer than 6 weeks. But I think that that's really interesting. And I think that's one reason why I enjoy talking to you is because we have so much of that need that we see at such large scale.
So I think to that point that you make about both of us having done accessibility work or disability inclusion work now for me here in corporate America, one of the challenges I think that can be tricky for folks is in a large corporation where there are always going to be competing priorities, how do we make sure that we build the business case? What are the pillars of that we use to help people understand and that can drive empathy so that accessibility does get prioritized?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have tried throughout a lot of history to build the business case for accessibility, to increase adoption of accessibility within their organization. And the W3C even put together an article, their Way Outreach, Education and Outreach Working Group put together an article to try and guide people. The challenge is, though, there's not a one-size-fits-all, and it really takes the context of the organization to be able to help you build that case. What drives one organization's business priorities may not be the same thing as another one. Some organizations lean very heavily into innovation, and that's definitely one of the pillars. We've seen throughout history that accessibility actually leads to innovation in the market, whether that be text messaging, closed captions, other features that were built to empower people with disabilities actually make things more usable for everyone. But my favorite's probably market differentiation. I think there's an unrealized value in accessibility that people don't talk about nearly enough, that accessible technology is usable technology. And the opposite is sometimes true too, that people sometimes think a lot about compliance as the main business driver, but compliant does not necessarily equal usable. Several years ago, a friend of mine, Damon, who uses a scooter, he has cerebral palsy and has very limited mobility, and we were going to check out a venue which in the United States, the American with Disabilities Act requires you to have accessible building spaces. One of those things is having 36 inches of width for like a hallway, right? So we were looking at a venue to try and have that. We wanted it to be an inclusive venue. So the vendor said, yes, we are ADA compliant. And of course, always trust but verify. So we brought Damon with us with his scooter. And one thing that people may not realize is that real world circumstances are never as tidy as the compliance requirements. So we brought Damon, he's driving his scooter, and if you've ever seen a modern scooter, it may be 36 inches of a width that can help someone pass through a hallway, but they're typically much longer than that. So the turn radius was impossible for him. And so we were having friends lift up an 800-pound scooter to turn it in order for Damon to be able to get into the building. And just, you know, that alone is an example that you have to be really thoughtful about your business drivers and what you're going to build those pillars, what you're going to build that business case with, because not all pillars are going to give you the same kind of end result. What about you? What's your favorite way to build the business case?
Gosh, I mean, I think to your point, it changes to some extent depending on the organization, depending on who you're talking to in the organization and their own level of comfort. Like I've been in a situation, and while I worked in accessibility, previously my role was more focused on accessible customer support experiences as opposed to digital accessibility, right? There's always a risk, and often when people are not familiar, the first question that gets asked is, well, how many people are we really talking about that need that, right? Like, how many people are really impacted? And I asked about empathy in my question, and I've been really thinking more about what's the difference between empathy versus compassion.
Yeah.
And I think the difference with compassion, both of them are about understanding the needs of other people and understanding the experience of other people. But where compassion goes a little bit further is compassion is action oriented. And so it's helping people understand it doesn't really matter so much how many people you're impacting. If you're impacting one person who can't use your service or product, like think about who you're excluding, right? And if you're excluding one person or one community, right? Say, you know, folks who are screen reader users or folks who are wheelchair or scooter users, like your example, how much, like, who are you excluding, right? And when you put the question like that, I think there's a deeper urgency to take action. If you even think about my origin story and how I got into this, it was like, oh no, here's this group of people that I'm excluding, and it might only be a handful. But as a result of that, like how many more people could we include, right? So for me, it's sometimes legal and compliance does make the case, right? And certainly it's not wrong. It's always a good starting place. At a minimum, we need to be compliant. But to get your organization to go beyond compliance and understand whether it is the innovation that you mentioned or the market differentiation, right? Or like the fact that if you build something and don't bake accessibility in at the beginning and have to go back and retrofit that, like from an efficiency and time savings and cost savings perspective, sometimes that's the argument that's going to resonate with your internal stakeholders. So it's about understanding like the needs, know your audience,
Yeah,
right?
very
Like
much.
understanding what matters to them, what are their goals, what are their drivers, and how can being accessible and inclusive help them meet those. I think
Yeah.
to me helps build compassion, whereas people don't just want to say, okay, I understand, but it's I understand and I want to take action.
I think that's fantastic. And I love how you're pointing to how much customization and context is really needed to win the business case for accessibility. I think not every audience has the same goals, but you touched on something that is one of the things that I find really rewarding, which is when accessibility can solve other business problems. When I was working back in this health insurance company and I was working to try and standardize, because it's another big pillar of accessibility, the value of standardizing your systems, your patterns, your processes, it yields more accessible content in the end, more accessible experiences for people. And I was working with the compliance team, and one of their challenges was that they had no standardized template for statements of work. And so everyone was kind of doing their own thing, and it became really difficult for them to be able to look and understand trends, to have less manual effort in creating those statements of work. So we worked together and we built accessibility as a clause within the statement of work. And in order to be able to ensure that accessibility was always included, it actually solved their problem where they had to use a standard template from that point. And so I think that that was really exciting to see how you can be the solution to other business problems that people have. If you look for it, accessibility tends to bring in a lot of really great best practices. What about you? Have you seen context really play out in the business case?
So I think, yes. And as you were saying that, what really struck me was this idea of, like, again, building people who are champions who then have that compassion and want to take action, right?
sure.
So one of the first things for me when I joined Workday, in fact, when I was interviewing for my position, my now boss had said, hey, this is one of the things we're looking at is that we've got ordering systems and opportunities in our on-site cafeteria here in our corporate office to make things more accessible, right? And so thinking about that, the good news is I came in and there were already some of the questions for the vendors as we were starting to try to source vendors to partner with us for food service. We looked at building those into the RFP process. So we went out and we told vendors, we want you to answer. And there were about 10 questions about accessibility that had already been baked in,
That's
right?
fantastic.
And so within my first month, we got the vendor responses back. It always becomes a challenge if folks who are looking at this aren't experts in this space. But I really appreciated being invited to partner in evaluating those responses, right? And the beautiful thing is it sent a message to our potential suppliers, right, or
Sure.
partners that, hey, this matters to us, right? If we're asking you all of these questions and we're saying like, hey, we want you to answer questions around accessibility, they now know, hey, this is important, right? But again, being able to be part of evaluating those responses and then sitting down with the, kind of the final three that it had been narrowed down to and be able to like participate in interviews, see demos of their technology, just like even the boards that, show like if your order is being prepped or if it's ready, being able to see all of those pieces, asking questions about what are you going to do if you have a wheelchair user come in and you want to make sure that they can reach things. Being able to do stuff independently. And ultimately, I even was able to do site visits to where some of these vendors had, other like locations. And ultimately, as a partner was selected, it wasn't the only thing that made this the right partner for us, but it certainly was a big factor. And now our real estate and workplace team are big champions of accessibility. So they're looking at like, how can we continue to partner more on this, right? So I love that idea of just being able to look at things and really get people involved so that they take that action.
That's wonderful. So it's really interesting to me that we approach access and inclusion from sort of different points, because you're thinking a lot about physical access, and I spend most of my days thinking about digital access, and yet this is the same person, the whole person. And I really appreciate that we have these two organizations that can really think about sort of a 360-degree equity. One thing that struck me too is I remember a story about how brand is another pillar for building the business case. How someone is viewed by the public and their commitment to inclusion not only makes a difference in, say, the purchase of a product, but also about the loyalty and that person's sphere and their radius of influence, and how they, in turn, are advocates for more inclusive products. And I was thinking about when I was a team of one, which many of us have either started out as or are continuing to be. My heart goes out to you. And I was helping our organization build a brand new palette, color palette and brand palette. And the marketing team had not actually brought it through any kind of accessibility testing. But they brought it to our CMO, and I was out of town. And they brought it to our CMO and showed him all of the new colors. And he didn't really understand accessibility very much, but he knew that it was important. He knew that he wanted it to be part of the brand of the organization that he was championing and leading. And so he asked, is that an accessible green? And of course, maybe it might be the answer, but the marketing team...
Not if it's on green.
Right, exactly. It depends, the favorite answer of every person in our field. But I think what was most interesting is that it had elevated to the point where it was in his mind as a chief marketing officer. So that's a win from an accessibility point of view, that it was on his mind. And I'm not so worried that he didn't really understand how to phrase the question, because then it triggered a whole conversation and a lot of work to really explore the brand palette. And of course the green was fine, but we were able to then provide really clear instructions about how to use it in a way that everyone could actually see green against another color and not, lose meaning in that. And what are some other things that you're thinking of as far as pillars that we would typically bring in to build the business case, knowing that empathy on its own and human rights, while most of us are in this field for that reason, is usually not going to be enough to be able to convince, an entire organization to change its plans?
Yeah, I think, again, it's about knowing what the goals and desired outcomes and the strategy for your organization on how they're going to get there, right? And maybe it might not be the whole organization, but that can vary by team within an organization. So it's about understanding your stakeholders' needs and then being able to help them demonstrate to them, how you're going to help them solve for that, right? So for me, as I think about accessible experiences, again, product and technology organizations, you've got folks who tend to want to be like innovative and market leaders and, get it out there quickly.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not always like it's speed is prioritized often over like perfection, right? So it's, if you can show how do you get it out there quickly, how's this going to help with this? How is this going to, if it's your sales organization, typically they want to know, sales leaders want to know, how is this going to help me sell more?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's taking the time to understand your audience that way and say, like, if you make this accessible, like you're expanding the market potential, right? And in fact, as you look at from a global landscape for those who may be operating globally, there are countries where if your products are not accessible, you may be not like limited in your ability to sell government contracts, right?
Yeah.
So, but that might not matter to somebody who's not trying to sell, right? So again, to me, I think it's about understanding what are the business drivers and then going to the right folks in the organization, right? Who are the ones who are building out that roadmap, who are responsible for projecting, like, what are we going to do here, right? You don't want to go too high, but you also don't want to go too low. So it's about understanding who are the right stakeholders and what's going to resonate with them.
Yeah. I think that's a valuable point, and you've mentioned a few times, and this is something that our team has been very focused on as well, that the two big things that tend to make an impact when you're talking to leadership is leading with data and tying that to the human existence and the storytelling. I think that we oftentimes forget that that is really the exchange, the currency of business discussions. Tell me what the data is behind the point you're trying to make, and wrap it in a story that is meaningful enough that it can resonate with me. And I think that definitely if we're talking to sales, we should talk about what kind of value proposition are we talking about? What difference might it make as far as lost revenue that you're leaving without really capitalizing on? Or if you're thinking in terms of your product inclusion team even, they may have a very strong focus on inclusion, but helping them and understanding how to tell the story in a way with data really helps strengthen their business case as well internally. And different organizations have different strengths and weaknesses. So I always find it really interesting. Again, people kind of want a one-size-fits-all, and the reality is you don't know till you're at that organization how that works. So do you have monthly releases? Do you have yearly releases? If you don't know the inner workings of the process of your business, you will always find yourself kind of trying to make sense of your information in their context, and it won't resonate with folks.
Well, and just to that same point, right? Again, I think release dates are not something I've ever really, in the capacity I've worked in this field, been as focused on, right? But I think consumer impact, right?
Yeah.
Often when you look at to me, it's, again, how do you get people past that point of, hey, this thing, it impacted 100 customers, and that can feel large, right? But when you're dealing with a company that has millions of customers, 100 customers isn't maybe so much. So it's understanding but what's the experience? Who are we excluding, right? And how can we bring more folks into the fold? And
For sure.
To your point, when you start to make things accessible, that word spreads so quickly through the disability community.
Yeah.
I know myself over the last few years, I've really leaned in to try to learn more and understand specifically in the deaf community as I was trying to look at the support services for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And the thing, as I've built relationships with that community and leaned into, trying to learn American Sign Language and, being on the board, I'm on the board of directors for a nonprofit that supports communications advocacy for deaf and hard of hearing people. But that community, the loyalty that they bring, they don't just come and bring their friends and family. They bring everybody they know when they see somebody who is leaning into making things inclusive.
So that speaks to brand as well. Organizations aren't aware sometimes that they're actually making a statement about their commitment to inclusion, either pro or apathetic, and that the ability for someone with disabilities to use a product, to use a service, to interact in an equitable way is a communication between an organization and that individual. And so Imani's quote on Twitter, I've always carried it with me for years because she just basically said that should you not provide that access, you are stating what your values are, one way or the other. And so I find that really impactful that people with disabilities are paying attention, like you said. And once they find that there's an organization with a commitment to inclusion, and they hire people with disabilities, they put people with disabilities in positions of decision-making within an organization, these kinds of actions really communicate that kind of commitment to inclusion, for sure.
100%. Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny you have that quote, because the quote I always think about, I heard it once, right? You've heard the saying, we're all in the same boat. I think the thing that stuck with me when I heard this was, we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm.
Yeah.
Some of us are on a yacht. Some of us are in a canoe. Some of us are not even in a boat. We're just hanging on over the edge. And so as you think about that, it's okay, when I recognize that somebody may not be in that same boat, what can I do to make more room so that everybody is able to get in that boat and make it through that storm together.
That's fantastic. Well, I think that's all the time that we have, Stacy, but thank you so much. Thank you for spending this time with us, and thank you, those of you who have joined us today, to tune in to our chat. I'd love for you to give the audience one last takeaway, and then we'll open things up for questions and further discussion.
Yeah, gosh, one last takeaway. I think it really is about leaning in, knowing your audience, knowing what matters to them, and then building champions who are going to drive compassion within your organization. Again, focusing on not just having empathy, but really what being willing to take action.
Yeah, I agree. And I think learning your audience and the language that they speak, if they speak in terms of data, you speak to them in terms of data. If they are absolutely moved by meaningful stories, then you incorporate those stories in the messaging for sure. Definitely. So now we'd like to open things up for further questions and discussion.